Good evening. I'm Matt Green, head of school here at Falmouth Academy, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our third installment of our community series, sponsored in part by the Woods Hole Foundation. We're in for a treat tonight. Our featured guest is concert pianist and musical raconteur Robert Wyatt. I'm also delighted to introduce you to Music Department Chair Mr. George Scharr, who will serve as our Master of Ceremonies for the evening's program.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am just so excited to be the host of this community series, number 3, Holidays in Vermont. This guest artist that we have is a well-known Cape Cod regional and Washington, D.C. artist, and I've wanted to work with him for a long time. I've known him over 20 years. Let's please welcome Robert Wyatt. Robert, thank you for
Hello, George.
Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me here today.
Oh, this is just so exciting. I mean, I don't know where to start. So let's introduce and reintroduce you to our audience. For some of you that may not know of Robert, you're going to be really impressed. Robert is a concert pianist, a Steinway artist, by the way, a Smithsonian lecturer, a raconteur, and a very good friend. And as if that weren't enough, he is a George Gershwin expert. So Robert does do talks at Falmouth Academy when we're not in a pandemic. And this year was a perfect opportunity to bring him in and get him in touch with his audience and friends. So Robert, you are known as a Gershwin expert. Let's talk about that for a little bit. I love to tell the story about how you found an unknown piece of Gershwin music. Would you tell our audience that story in case they don't know it?
Yes, when I was finishing a doctoral degree at Florida State University, your dissertation was really 5 recitals, 2 solo recitals, chamber music recital, a lecture recital, and a concerto with the orchestra. And you also were given a treatise just to make sure that you were literate. So you had to write a 70, 80-page paper. So I was studying with Edward Kalenny Jr., who was the son of Gershwin's first theory teacher. And he was a magnificent teacher, and his father sounded like a real character. But Mr. Kalenny had met George Gershwin when he was 8 years old, and he came to his father's apartment to take theory lessons. So Mr. Kalenny never knew his name, but he knew that he was the guy who sat around and played jazzy ragtime music on their piano. He also could smell his cigar smoke on his body and his breath. And one night, Mr. Kalenny was in the library towards the back of the room. Gershwin came into the room, picked up the telephone, and placed a bet on the Roosevelt Raceway. So I said, well, each time I said, it could have been Gershwin. Once I heard about the bet, I said, you definitely met George Gershwin. So I was looking for some material on Edward Kalenny's father, and I turned to a biography by Charles Schwartz, which wasn't a very good biography, by the way. And at the very bottom, it mentioned that Józefa Różańska was in the possession of several piano solos that were unpublished. So I caught that and I said, this might be a wonderful topic for my treatise. And I went to the Library of Congress and I researched Józefa Różańska for 2 weeks, found nothing about her, and I was very frustrated. Mr. Kalenny and I talked every week on the telephone once I'd moved from Tallahassee to Washington, D.C. And so I said, Mr. Gershwin, Józefa Różańska is someone I just can't find. So he says, oh, Josie. So he says, she studied with my father at the same time Gershwin did. And so he had last seen her in Manhattan in 1930. And so he says, I think that she's still living in New York. So I called the directory assistants. Remember the days when we used to actually pick up a telephone to find someone's telephone number? And they gave it to me. I called her apartment on Amsterdam and 83rd, and a woman answered. I said, hello, is this Józefa Rozenska? And the woman says, no, it's not. And I said, I'm sorry, they gave me the wrong number, and I hung up. So I called directory assistants. They gave me the same number. I called back 30 seconds later, and no one answered the phone. No one answered the phone for 10 days until finally the same voice came on. And I said, excuse me, is this the residence of Józefa Rozenska? And she said, yes, it is. And as it turns out, she was Józefa Rozenska's grandniece who was living in her great aunt's rent-controlled apartment in New York City after her great aunt had died. So she had no idea about these pieces, but she said that she would call her father, who eventually found the scores. He sent me photocopies, and he also donated the scores to the Library of Congress.
So today, if we were to go looking for these scores, they would be in the Library of Congress.
They would be in the Gershwin collection.
Isn't that an honor? That is just fabulous. So tell us about, I wish I could hear these pieces. I can only imagine. Tell us about what they sound like and what's the name of this piece?
Well, the first one was written in 1919, and Gershwin said it was called Novella and Fourths. So it's parallel fourths, and it's a real rag. It's a piano rag. And the interesting part is George Gershwin actually recorded it for a piano roll. So we can, in fact, listen to George Gershwin playing the piece that I found in Józefa Rozenska's apartment. Oh. So here's the clip of George Gershwin playing the Novella and Fourths, 1919.
Robert, that was incredible. I'm so thrilled that we got a chance to actually hear Novella in Fourths by Gershwin. As I listen to him, Gershwin has a most unique sound. How would you characterize his sound?
Well, Gershwin started studying classical music when he was just a boy. And when he learned how to play, he liked to improvise. He also liked to read music. And he liked especially Bach and Chopin. And eventually he got to know Debussy as soon as he made it to Paris. He started working as a piano pounder on Tin Pan Alley when he was 17 years old. And he started making the piano rolls right then because he was hired by a firm in New Jersey. He would cross the river and he would maybe record for 2 hours. And he made almost 150 different piano rolls between the time he was 17 and 22. But sometimes he even used pseudonyms. He didn't use his own name. He recorded under at least 4 different names.
Oh my! Now, just a word for our audience about Tin Pan Alley. Tin Pan Alley was where professional pianists hung out outside of publishing houses.
Yes.
People who wanted to buy a particular sheet of music would go in, but they wanted to hear the music first.
Yes.
So bring it out to the pianist, right? And they would sit there. And the pianist would have to virtually sight read. I always tell my students how important sight reading is. They'd have to sight read this piece of music. And
they'd also have to improvise and modulate into different keys. If the singer was too low, they'd have to throw it up a perfect fourth. So Gershwin learned to play in every key because he had to adjust his key to the voice of the singer who wanted to buy the score for 25 cents. So it's where he really learned improvisation.
Oh my goodness, that's just an incredible story. Well, that explains his piano chops and his great knowledge of all different kinds of music.
Yes.
Well, that was quite a find. I'm sure that everybody loved Novella in Fourths. So, you also have a long history with the Smithsonian, and many of our viewers may not know that you actually spent a lot of time living in DC and Virginia area. Tell us, how did you get to the Smithsonian? What's your Smithsonian connection? What do you do for them? And I understand you have a very fascinating story about how you made that connection. Tell our audience.
Yes. Well, in 1990, I had become the director of public relations at the Levine School, which is a conservatory in Washington, D.C. It's a community music school. So actually 4 different sites. There were hundreds of faculty members and thousands of students. So I was the public relations director. And one day I took a call from a gentleman who was a programmer at the Smithsonian. And he asked if we had a faculty member who was a musicologist with a specialty in German music, because he was looking for someone to lead a course, an 8-week course on Richard Wagner. And so I said, I've always wanted to be connected with the Smithsonian. So yes, we do have a scholar. And he said, who is that? And I said, it's me. So he had told me that, the course was going to begin in 4 months. So I thought, I have 4 months to study and learn all of the things I need to know to be an expert on Richard Wagner. So I accepted the gig, and I began research. I bought 4 different biographies. I made all kinds of recording tapes and quizzes, and it was such a lovely course that I had arranged. Opening night, there was probably maybe 50 or 60 people in the audience, and I had this wonderful program, and I started talking. I was dapper, I was intelligent, I was informative. And after 10 minutes of the lecture, a man raised his hand and he said, well, Michael Tilson Thomas is beginning the ring cycle. And he says, could you please tell us how Tilson Thomas's ring cycle is different than Richard Wagner's cycle back in 1848 to 1874? So I realized that I was nailed. I realized this man knew much more than I did. So it turns out that he was a charter member of the Wagner Society of Washington, D.C., and he was checking out if I really knew my facts. And of course I didn't. So I would say, let me check on that. I'll be with you next week. So next week there were maybe 10 fewer people in the audience. By the week 3, there were only 30 people left. So we ended the 8-week course with a wonderful group of people who knew that I was learning Richard Wagner just like they were.
What a great story.
And I was told by one of my friends at the Smithsonian that you always were rated. The audience members, when they left, would give you a review. And so he said it's all about the numbers. If you have good numbers, they'll invite you back. If not, you're done. So I said, I think I'm done, because 6 months later, I had not heard from the Smithsonian. Finally, I did, and that was 39 different programs later. So I've given 39 programs of which I've been an expert. I'm an expert on anything I can have at least 3 weeks to prepare.
That's a great story. So the Smithsonian, after this Wagnerian debacle, the Smithsonian called you back up and said, hey, would you do a Gershwin series for us? Is that right?
Well, I've given 5 different Gershwin programs for the Smithsonian. I gave one on Porgy and Bess when the Washington National Opera had a performance in 1995, the 60th anniversary of the original Porgy and Bess in New York in 1935. I've given, Broadway composers, Rachmaninoff, Bach, Gershwin, Brahms, Mozart. So I've been a person who has specialties in symphonic arrangement. I've done so many different programs.
Isn't that?
I did Elvis Presley. I did Frank Sinatra, Judy Garland, Johnny Mercer. It's been a wonderful combination of people in D.C. learning things and me learning things. So I've become a lot more intelligent because I've been given lots of programs.
Well, music is music, and certainly these great artists led colorful lives, and they were very often colorful caricatures as well. And they give us a lot of fodder from which to work. It's great. So you have an interesting segment now that we're going to show our audience. I understand you have some slides of Gershwin. Tell us what we're going to put up next.
Well, over the years, I have gathered really incredible photographs. Some, I've actually found in books. Others, Gershwin had a girlfriend, Kay Swift. She was actually the first woman to write a Broadway show. 1930, she wrote Fine and Dandy. Gershwin had an affair with Kay Swift from 1925 until 1936. And I visited her several times in New York, and she handed me photographs and autographed scores that Gershwin, they were written in his hand. And so she gave me photographs that she had taken of Gershwin at their farm in Westchester County back in 1925 and 26. So I have Gershwin on horses, Gershwin with dogs. And then I've gathered other things in the meanwhile from Kay Swift's granddaughter, Catherine Weber. So I have some interesting photos that I think you would be enjoyed.
So as we play these slides for our audience, we're going to hear music in the background, and I think it's you playing Gershwin, isn't it? What are we going to hear?
It is. Back in 1932, Gershwin was trying to gather money to write Porgy and Bess. So he stopped writing Broadway shows, and he actually had some of his improvisations published. It's called George Gershwin Songbook. It has 18 improvisations on his favorite songs. The first improvisation is on Swanee, which was also George Gershwin's first big hit. 1919, he and Al Jolson, recorded Swanee, and he made his first fortune. So I'm starting with Swanee, and then I'm going to I'll Build a Stairway to Paradise, which was from a show called George White's Scandals in 1923. And then I'll break into The Man I Love, which is a piece that never made it into a Broadway show. It got cut from Lady Be Good in 1924, cut from OK in 1926, cut from Strike Up the Band, until finally Gershwin just raised his hand and said, well, we'll just let go of that piece. It was resurrected in 1928 and made into a hit song, and Gershwin's improvisation is spectacular. And that segues right into Gershwin's favorite piece of all time called I Got Rhythm.
Robert, those pictures and that music was just priceless. Some of those pictures I've never seen before. And to hear you playing Gershwin like that in the style he intended was very touching. Now, I understand that you've worked with, or you've heard from producers recently in Hollywood to help them with a Porgy and Bess maybe production. Would you tell our audience about that?
George, I moved to Washington, D.C. in 1985 as I was finishing my doctoral program, mainly to do research at the Library of Congress. While there, I met a wonderful soprano who studied with Todd Duncan, who was George Gershwin's choice to be Porgy in the opera in 1935. So she took me over to Mr. Duncan's studio, and we talked, we had lunch, I met his wife, I saw his photographs, and after a while he says, well, you're a pianist, would you like to accompany my students in my studio? And I says, yes, Mr. Duncan. So for every week on Monday mornings, I showed up at Todd Duncan's studio on Upshur Street Northwest in DC, and I played for his 4 students who would come from Philadelphia from the Curtis Institute of Music.
Oh my.
So I played for Mr. Duncan for 8 years. I got to hear all of his stories. Sometimes after we finished teaching at 12 o'clock, we would go up and have lunch, and we would always have a little thimbleful of scotch. He liked to have a cigar and scotch at lunchtime. So when I did the Gershwin Reader in 2004, I had interviews with Mr. Gershwin and with Anne Brown, who was the original Bess, who came to visit her sister in Silver Springs every year. So 3 months ago, I got a phone call from a screenwriter in Hollywood who had become very interested in writing a new film about Porgy and Bess from 1935. His angle was he was trying to show the racial controversy between these wonderful African-American opera singers and what it was like to be residents of Catfish Row in South Carolina at the turn of the century, who were uneducated, drug-dealing, hardworking, fast-moving black people. Right. So Mr. Duncan told me lots of stories, and Josh Singer, who was the Academy Award winner in 1915 for his screenplay for Spotlight, about the Boston Globe exploration of sexual abuse by priests.
Okay.
And he was very interested in Mr. Duncan and my relationship with him. And then he brought in a friend of his, Barry Jenkins, who was also an Academy Award winner for his film Moonlight the next year, 2016. So I would have Zoom talks and telephone talks with these 2 wonderful Broadway artists, and they're working on a film about George Gershwin and Todd Duncan and Anne Brown and all the cast members of Porgy and Bess from 1935.
Oh my. Well, keep us in mind. We have a beautiful performing arts center at Falmouth Academy. We'd love to have that there. That would be great.
Yeah.
Well, now, speaking of Falmouth Academy, you have a wonderful Cape Cod connection, which is how we met almost 20 years ago. You became the director of the Cape Conservatory. Actually, at that point, it was called the Cape Cod Conservatory, 2 locations, one in Falmouth and one in Barnstable. So you were in DC at the time, and how did you make that connection? I was friendly with the president of the board of directors at that time, and they were very excited that you were accepting the offer to come up and be the director. How did that connection happen? That's a fascinating story.
And I was joyous as well. On September 11th, 2001, I saw smoke coming out of the Pentagon, and I thought that it might be time for me to leave Washington, D.C. after 15 years of being a resident. 2 months after 9/11, I saw an advertisement in the New York Times and also the Washington Post asking for an executive director of a music conservatory on Cape Cod. So I applied. 5 months later, I made the first cut. 10 months later, I was selected as the new executive director of the Cape Cod Conservatory. And in June of 2002, I took my Miata and I drove up to Cape Cod, and I became a resident for over 15 years.
So where did you put the Steinway in the back of a Miata? That's what I want to know.
Well, I actually had a U-Haul trailer that had the Steinway in the back, and I had a trailer with my Miata on it.
Now, speaking of that, is that the same Steinway I see behind you?
It actually is. I bought this Steinway in 1993, and I've had it ever since. It's having a new set of strings, new set of dampers, and a lot of tunings.
Now, is that a Model D? I can't quite tell
It's a
from
Model B, yes, 7 feet long.
It's a 7 foot long, and I think that's probably a sister piano to the one we have at the Simon Center, which is a 1998 vintage, and it's generally considered to be a terrific piano, one of the best on the Cape.
I played on it. I played on it twice with the Simon Sinfonietta.
Oh, of course, that's right, and of course, folks at home, the Simon Center for the Arts is named after Stephen Simon. And I guess, Robert, come to think of it, we did play together at that point, because
I think we did the Beethoven B flat and maybe the Schubert E minor. I can't remember what concertos we did.
I know Stephen.
I played 5 different concertos with Stephen, and it was one of the joys of my life.
Exactly, and same here. And he didn't often use a trombone section, but when he did, he tended to focus on chamber music. I was fortunate enough to be one of the trombones that he selected. So I want to talk about that room where you are now, because there's something special about that Steinway, and even something special about the room in which it sits. This isn't just an average living room like I have behind me here. This is, you're in a treehouse. You're in a treehouse. Would you tell us about that?
Well,
In
I
Vermont.
first came to Vermont when I was a junior in college. A group of my friends, we hopped in their car and we drove up here to see the foliage in October of, probably 1969. And I said, this is beautiful. I'd love to live here someday. 2015, I was invited to be a piano professor at the Kinhaven Music Center in the summer. And I came up for the second time, and I says, I really want to live here sometime in my life. So I saved money and I arranged to come up here. So in 2016, I moved to Vermont. And about a year ago, I moved to this beautiful place on a ridge of the Green Mountains in New Haven, Vermont. And when I moved here with Mary, she had built a barn 40 years ago. She built the house and the barn. She's a very talented woman. And we looked at it, and it was falling down. And so we were both thinking this might be a really great piano studio. So we hired a wonderful carpenter, and he converted this old barn into a magnificent dwelling for my Steinway piano and my table and it's magnificent.
Now, we're going to go one step better, because I've seen snapshots of that in the construction, because Robert and I have been talking about doing this interview for a long time. So we're going to put up some pictures now of the construction of that treehouse. And there's one particular interesting anecdote here. How do we deal with the Steinway in a treehouse? How did you do that, Robert?
Well, northern piano movers took my pianos from Cape Cod and brought them to Vermont. I gave one of my 2 pianos to my niece in Michigan. And when I was moving from my apartment in Middlebury to my home in New Haven, I called the same mover. And so he says, of course we'll move your piano. And so he says, does it have to go upstairs? And I said, well, yes, it does. And so I took a photograph of the stairs to the treehouse, and he says, we can't do that. So we hired it's called a luff loader. So it's a crane. So the piano movers dropped my piano on the driveway right in front of the treehouse. He took his luff loader up the hill, up the ridge. He brought it in. I coordinated the operation for 2 weeks. Finally, it took 20 minutes for them to drop the piano, luff loader onto the deck on the 2nd floor of the barn, and they just moved the piano in.
Robert, that's quite a story. Lifting a Steinway. I've heard of piano movers, and my mother was a piano teacher, and I've seen a lot of moves, but never one up into a treehouse over a barn. Fantastic. And I can see those trees out the back window. It's great. In the meantime, we've shown some snapshots of the area while you've been speaking, and it is just a beautiful area. I can see why you fell in love with that area. Now, we have another interesting segment that you've prepared for our audience coming up. And this involves some photographs and some special music. Would you tell us about how you put these two together?
Yes, last year I met a resident of Middlebury, Vermont, Trent Campbell, who for 18 years was the photographer for the Addison Independent. That's the Falmouth enterprise of Middlebury, Vermont. So I was thinking that perhaps if I could play Schubert's Impromptu in G flat, and he could be including 40 or 50 of his favorite holiday shots of Vermont, it would make a nice duet. So Trent went through his collection of over 3,000 photographs, and he picked as many as he could that had snow and geese and barn doors and children, and he put them together into a slideshow that's going to be accompanied by Franz Schubert's Impromptu in G flat major, one of my favorite piano pieces.
And this is you playing the Schubert.
Yes.
Robert, that was spectacular. I really feel like I'm in Vermont. And here it is, December on Cape Cod. And you have really brought the feeling of Christmas into all of our homes and spirits. Thank you so much. So, probably as if this weren't grand enough, the next segment is the one that really, really excites me. We've seen Gershwin's and slides, we've had you playing in the background, but now you have combined some Gershwin videos that have no sound from the silent era. And I want to tell the audience how you found those and then how we're going to present those in the next musical segment. This is wildly exciting. Thank you, Robert.
In 1987, I found the two novelettes, and I didn't know exactly what to do with them. You know, I had these wonderful scores of piano pieces. I could play them myself, but I just didn't know how to release them to the world. So I had read many Gershwin biographies, but there was one man who stood above everyone else. His name was Ed Jablonski, and he lived in New York. So again, I called New York directory, and I got his telephone number. I called up, and he spoke immediately to me, and he invited me to go from Washington, D.C. up to New York City to meet him. So I took my little photocopies of my scores, and I drove up to Manhattan, and we met at a bar on 72nd and West End Ave. And it turns out that he was there every day at noontime, having lunch and a few drinks. So we talked for maybe an hour, and he said, "Would you like to come back to my apartment?" So we walked a few blocks over to 75th in Amsterdam, and I went up to his second floor apartment. It was just filled with Gershwin memorabilia. He had scores, he had photographs, he had recordings, and we talked maybe for 3 hours. And when I left, he says, "You know, I have a few things to give you." So he gave me an original Gershwin piece of staff paper that Gershwin had printed for him back in 1935. He gave me some wonderful photographs. And he also said, "You know, watch these." He had Gershwin home movies. Gershwin had a motion picture camera, and his brother Ira also had a camera. So they took pictures. And so Ed gave me these wonderful, you know, silent movie clips of George Gershwin, his friends. And so I thought that I could play them for you. And you're going to see many famous people. You're going to see Arnold Schoenberg, the 12-tone composer, who was a neighbor of George Gershwin's when he moved to Hollywood to make 3 films in 1936. You're going to meet Harold Arlen, who 2 years later paired with his friend Yip Harburg and wrote a little show called The Wizard of Oz. So you're going to see Harold Arlen playing tennis with George Gershwin. You're going to meet Gershwin's entire family, his brother Ira, his sister Frankie, her husband Leopold Godofsky, who invented Kodachrome film. You're going to meet, who else is in? You're going to meet some of Gershwin's friends in Paris in 1928 when he wrote An American in Paris. You're going to meet Paul Mueller, who was Gershwin's chauffeur driving his fancy car. You're going to see all kinds of magnificent shots. Of course, you know, the microphone wasn't invented until 1925, and music didn't appear on sound until the Jazz Singer of 1927. So these clips have no sound. But you and I will be talking. More than anything, George Gershwin loved to play the piano. It brought him great joy. He played and sang for his family and friends in their homes and for millions of other people on concert stages, over the radio, and on record players. He said, "When I'm in my normal mood, music drips from my fingers." Here he plays with Italian pianist Mario Brogiotti while he was in Europe in 1928, writing An American in Paris. Aren't they having fun? He was a terrible singer. Gershwin lived with his parents, brothers, and sister until he was 30 years old. In 1929, he and his brother Ira moved into adjoining penthouses at 33 Riverside Drive, once the home of Sergei Rachmaninoff. Meet Tony, a terrier given to him by Kay Swift, the nearest to being a true love in Gershwin's life. Luckily, the ASPCA was missing at the filming that day. Gershwin took his home movie camera into the Alvin Theater in New York City to catch Ruben Mamoulian, Greta Garbo's favorite filmmaker, directing a rehearsal of Porgy and Bess. Mamoulian was a master of shadows, and here the cast prays to expel the devil from their room as the hurricane surges in Act 2. And there's Jake and his crewmen mending their nets before sailing into the deep waters. Todd Duncan and Anne Bren, Gershwin's Porgy and Bess, discuss her divorce with a shyster lawyer. And there they are again casting out the devil, but with no shadows. John Bubbles, a vaudevillian dancer, was the cast's only star. He played Sport and Life, the local drug dealer. And here, Mr. Duncan and Anne Bren were singing their famous second act duet, Bess, You Is My Woman Now. Sport and Life tries to seduce Bess into leaving Catfish Row, and there's a boat that's leaving soon for New York. And now his exit. Porgy and Bess proved to be a flop Broadway show, and in 1936 the brothers moved to Hollywood to make musical films. Here they are visiting the Salton Sea near the Mexican border. And there's their childhood friend Yip Harburg, notable as the poet of Brother, Can You Spare a Dime and April in Paris. In 2 years, he would write all the lyrics of The Wizard of Oz, including Over the Rainbow. And yes, George, you identified Gershwin's car as a Cord, which sold for $3,000 in 1935, the equivalent of $40,000 in today's currency. The brothers moved into a fashionable Hollywood mansion complete with tennis court, swimming pool, 8 bedrooms, and a bath. Here he plays with Yip Harburg. And then he towels off with Harold Arlen, Harburg's partner and composer of 500 songs, including Stormy Weather, Get Happy, and Over the Rainbow. And something's not quite right with the Gershwin's teeth. Now Ira's filming his brother playing tennis. With his latest Hollywood starlet, Simone. And there's Ruben Mamoulian, the director again. Oh, Simone looks like a high school cheerleader flirting with her boyfriend. Aren't they cute? This brief clip is one of my favorites, showing the brothers clowning around. Never were there two greater friends. Gershwin's family arrived from New York in February of 1933. There's his mother, Rose, a widow after the death of her husband a few years earlier. Ira stands behind his wife, Leonore, while his brother Ira smokes his pipe. Stretches and then joins the baby of the family, Frankie, who was the first Gershwin on stage. She had already sung in a Paris revue by Cole Porter and retired in 1930 to marry Leopold Godowsky, an itinerant violinist who later invented Kodachrome film. Frankie has become the wealthiest and even more famous than her brothers. This film features Gershwin's neighbor and tennis partner Arnold Schoenberg, the father of 12-tone music and one of the greatest musical minds of the 20th century. Violinist Rudolf Kolisch was the founder of the Kolisch Quartet, which premiered all 4 of Schoenberg's string quartets. Gershwin rolls his camera. And here comes Gertrude, Schoenberg's wife, who gently pats her husband's head. In March of 1937, Gershwin met Paulette Goddard at the home of his childhood friend, Edward G. Robinson. Also in attendance were Douglas Fairbanks, Marlene Dietrich, and Goddard's husband, Charlie Chaplin. A brief romance followed, with Goddard secretly meeting Gershwin wherever they dared. This clip was shot by Ira when they went on a Palm Springs vacation in May of 1937. Gershwin was very much in love with Paulette and proposed to her, an offer she refused. A few months later, Gershwin died suddenly from a brain tumor. He was only 38 years old. Tanned, handsome, talented George Gershwin was quite the man. His friend Irving Berlin wrote a poem for the memorial service, which concludes, "A songwriter's job may be ended, but his melody lingers on."
So, Robert, that was very fascinating. I was especially captivated by the last part. I did not know that Gershwin had an affair with Charlie Chaplin's wife. What else do you know about that?
Well, when George Gershwin went to Hollywood in 1936 to write 3 movies, Shall We Dance, Goldwyn's Follies, and A Damsel in Distress, he met many women, but he had affairs with Simone, who was a single Hollywood actress, and also with Paulette Goddard, who was married to Charlie Chaplin.
Oh, geez.
So they had a passionate affair, and it was actually kind of funny because, it was difficult to meet privately. So she would go to Gershwin's house and play tennis and sunbathe by his pool. But also they had a way of trysting that was very interesting. They would both have their chauffeur-driven limousines meet somewhere in the canyons around Hollywood, and Paulette would zip into Gershwin's car, and her car would go shooting off in the other direction because Charlie Chaplin had hired detectives to watch what his wife was doing. So she'd be in one car with Gershwin, her car would go over leading the detectives out of the way. And he and Paulette went to Palm Springs with Ira, actually, who took the film that we just saw. And it's really Gershwin died of a brain tumor only 2 months later. So what we're actually seeing is the last film evidence of George Gershwin.
Fascinating stuff. Very, very touching. Robert, this has just been a thrill. Holidays in Vermont with Robert Wyatt, community series, part of Falmouth Academy's virtual community series this year of pandemic. There's 3 more community series coming after the first of the year. You're going to meet John Nakamatsu, another pianist and the founder of the Cape Cod Chamber Music Festival, and 2 other special surprise guests as well. And those will be airing, those dates and guests will be announced very shortly. In the meantime, Robert, you and I have been friends for a long time, and I have always wanted to play with you. And, you're in Vermont, I'm on Cape Cod, we're in a virtual world these days. You're a pianist, I'm a trombonist. I think given the photos that we've just seen by Trent Campbell, how about we give a virtual rendition? You'll play over there and I'll play over here of Moonlight in Vermont.
Sensational. Let's do it.